Nah, the parking lot of St. Andrew's Presbyterian was half full when I pulled in. I sat in my car for 6 minutes. I know because I counted. Counted the seconds the way I used to count ceiling tiles in my childhood bedroom when I heard him coming down the hall. My husband reached over and put his hand on mine. "You don't have to go in," he said. "I know," I said, and I got out of the car. The call came on a Tuesday. I was in the middle of a client meeting when my phone buzzed. My aunt's number, one I hadn't seen on a screen in 11 years. I let it go to voicemail. When I listened to it in the parking garage afterward, her voice was thin and carefully arranged, the way people arrange flowers at a funeral before anyone arrives. "Your mother passed this morning, Lena. The service is Saturday. I thought you should know." That was it. "No, we want you there." "No, please come. Just the information, delivered like a weather forecast." My mother's name was Sandra. She had brown hair that she always wore pinned at the back of her neck, and she made the best butter tarts in Simcoe County. She also watched my father drive me to the edge of town with a single garbage bag of my things when I was 17, and she did not come to the door. I drove home in silence. My husband was already there, standing in the kitchen when I walked in, and when he saw my face, he didn't ask anything. He just opened his arms and I walked into them, and I stood there for a long time with my face against his collar. "Her service is Saturday," I finally said. "I know," he said. "I already looked it up. That's the kind of man he is. His name is Marcus. He's a Crown attorney with the Ontario Ministry of the Attorney General. We met when I was 26 and working as a paralegal at a firm in Hamilton. And he walked in one afternoon looking for someone else entirely and ended up finding me. We've been married for 4 years. He's methodical and quiet, and he has the kind of patience that makes people in courtrooms very nervous. He held my face in both hands that night and said, "Whatever you decide, I'm with you." I decided to go. I need to tell you why I left. Because the version of events my father told Simcoe County is not the version that happened. The version he told people, I heard this secondhand years later, was that I was wild, ungrateful, that I ran away at 17 to follow some boy and they tried everything to bring me back, and eventually they had to let me go. Here is what actually happened. My father's name is Walter. He has run Kowalski Property Management in Barrie since before I was born. Rental units, a few commercial properties, nothing that would impress anyone in Toronto, but enough to make him feel like a significant man in a small orbit. He coached minor hockey for 12 years. He organized the Christmas fundraiser at our church 3 years running. Everyone knew Walter Kowalski. Everyone liked Walter Kowalski. Everyone liked Walter Kowalski. Inside our house, Walter Kowalski kept a different set of rules. Not physical. I want to be precise about this, because people always want it to be physical, something that leaves a mark someone else can see. It wasn't that. It was quieter and more architectural than that. It was my marks being wrong no matter how high they were. It was his hand on my shoulder at dinner parties in a way that looked like affection and functioned like restraint. It was the night I told my mother I wanted to go to law school, and she looked at my father before she answered me. When I was 17, I got a bursary, a partial scholarship to study at McMaster in Hamilton. I had applied without telling anyone. When the letter arrived, I made the mistake of being happy about it at the dinner table. He didn't raise his voice. He never raised his voice. He simply said that I would not be going, that I was too young, that Hamilton was no place for a girl on her own, and that the conversation was finished. I said it wasn't finished. 3 days later, he drove me to the Barrie bus terminal with one garbage bag. He gave me $40. He said, "You want to be on your own? Fine, you're on your own." My mother sat in the passenger seat. She did not turn around. I was 17 years old, and I had $40 and a garbage bag, and I stood on Dunlop Street watching their car until it turned the corner and disappeared. I won't make this into something cinematic. The next year was hard in ways I still don't talk about much. I slept on a friend's couch for 6 weeks. I got a job at a Tim Hortons. I deferred my McMaster bursary by 1 year. They were kind about it, kinder than I deserved, kinder than most people would be, and I used that year to save enough to actually get there. I did go to law school eventually. Not McMaster. I ended up at Osgood. It took me longer than it takes most people, because I was doing it without anyone's help, and I am not going to apologize for how long it took. I built a life. I built it from the ground, the way you build things when there's no foundation underneath you, slowly and carefully and always a little afraid the whole thing might tip over. And then somewhere around 31, I looked around at what I had made and realized it was solid. It was mine, and I had done it without him. I hadn't spoken to my father in 11 years. I hadn't spoken to my mother in 8. There had been a brief thaw when I was 25, a phone call, a coffee in a Tim's off the 400. But she kept saying, "Your father thinks, and you know how your father is." And eventually I realized she was not actually there. She was a set of clothes on a chair. I stopped calling, and then she was gone, and I was standing in a parking lot in Barrie, counting seconds, deciding. The church was cool inside the way old Ontario churches always are. Stone and wood and light that comes in at an angle and makes everything look like it's been preserved. The organist was playing something soft. There were maybe 60 people in the pews. I walked in with Marcus beside me. I had dressed carefully. Black coat, the good one. Hair pinned back. I looked composed because I had practiced looking composed in the mirror that morning for 15 minutes. I saw my father before he saw me. He was standing near the front, shaking hands, receiving condolences the way he always received things, as though they were his due. He had aged, but not in a diminished way. He was still broad-shouldered, still holding the room without seeming to try. 2 men I didn't recognize stood just behind him, hovering the way people hover when they're positioned rather than standing. I took a seat near the middle on the left side. Marcus sat next to me. We were there for 4 minutes before I heard a woman somewhere behind me whisper, and then the whisper moved through the rows like a current, and I knew he had seen us. I kept my eyes forward. I heard his footsteps before anything else. He always walked heel first, a particular sound. He stopped at the end of our pew. "Lena." His voice was the same. Conversational. Controlled. "This is not the place." I turned and looked at him. "I'm here for my mother's funeral," I said. "So is this exactly the place?" Something moved across his face. Not anger. Not yet. Calibration. "You weren't invited," he said. "A funeral isn't an invitation event," I said. "It's a church service." He looked at Marcus. "And who is this?" "My husband," I said. He held Marcus's gaze for a moment, then looked back at me. "I'd like you to leave quietly," he said. "Out of respect for your mother." "I'm here out of respect for my mother," I said. "So I'll be staying." He straightened. "I'll have you escorted out." I said nothing to that. I turned back toward the front of the church and folded my hands in my lap. He wasn't bluffing, which I knew going in. My father has never bluffed in his life. He doesn't need to. One of the men who had been hovering near him came down the side aisle. He introduced himself as someone who managed the church property, a friend of my father's, which meant, in this room, a man whose loyalties had been arranged in advance. "Miss, I'm going to have to ask you to leave the premises," he said. "I'm not a miss. I'm a married woman, and I'm attending my mother's funeral," I said, still looking forward. "The family has requested." "I am family," I said. "Lena Kowalski-Chandra, Sandra Kowalski's daughter. You can confirm that with anyone here." He looked at my father. My father gave a very small nod. "I'm going to have to call the police," the man said. "Then call them," I said. Marcus put his hand on my knee. Not to stop me. He knew better. Just to tell me he was there. It took 12 minutes for the Barrie police to arrive. I know because Marcus timed it. 2 officers came in through the side door. Young, one of them clearly uncomfortable, both of them reading the room and not liking what they were reading. My father met them at the aisle and spoke to them for a moment, quiet enough that I couldn't hear. Then they came to our pew. "Ma'am, we've received a complaint. I'm attending my mother's funeral," I said. "Sandra Ann Kowalski. I am her biological daughter. I have committed no offense." "The property owner, this is a church," I said. "It's a house of worship and a public memorial. I would like the statute you're citing." The younger officer glanced at his partner. His partner said, "Ma'am, if you could just come outside with us." "I'd like the statute," I said again, pleasantly. There was a pause. "Walter." My father's friend was looking at him now. "Walter, maybe." "She's trespassing," my father said from the aisle. "Remove her." They asked me to stand up. I stood up. Marcus stood up beside me. One of the officers began explaining that I was being asked to leave the premises, and if I refused, it would be considered trespassing, and I said, clearly enough for the nearest 2 pews to hear, "I am Sandra Kowalski's daughter. I have a right to attend her memorial, and I'd like this noted." They put me in cuffs. I want to be clear about that. They actually put me in handcuffs at my mother's funeral in front of 60 people because my father told them to. I heard someone behind me say, "Oh my God," and someone else say nothing at all, which was worse. They walked me toward the side door. "We didn't make it. Excuse me." Marcus's voice carries. It's one of the things about him in a room full of noise. His voice lands with a weight that makes people stop. It's not loud. It's just certain. Both officers stopped. He stepped into the aisle and held up his credentials. Not making a show of it, just holding them out, steady, the way he does everything. "Marcus Chandra," he said. "Crown Attorney. Ministry of the Attorney General, Ontario. I'd like to know what charge you're laying." The older officer looked at the credentials, looked at Marcus. "Sir, this is a trespass complaint," Marcus said. "I heard. I'd like to know the legal basis. This is a public church memorial. My wife is the biological child of the deceased. Under what provision is her presence unlawful?" The younger officer had gone very still. "If you're acting on a third-party complaint," Marcus said, with the even tone he uses in courtrooms, "I'd recommend you consider the liability implications of removing a next of kin from a public memorial on the request of another private individual. That's a conversation that tends to get complicated." He reached into his inside jacket pocket and produced a letter. He held it out to the officer. "This is a letter from my wife's family solicitor confirming her status as Sandra Kowalski's legal next of kin and her standing as a named beneficiary in the original estate documentation. You'll note it was prepared in advance of today. We anticipated a situation like this." The older officer read it. "Read it again." He looked at his partner. He looked at my father. My father's face had changed. It was the expression of a man watching a set of walls he built very carefully start to demonstrate, very quietly, that they were load-bearing. "Walter," someone said from a pew. An older woman, someone I didn't recognize. "Walter, this is Sandra's daughter." My father said nothing. "Walter." A man this time, further back. The officer turned to my father. "Sir, in light of, she's not in my will," my father said. His voice was still controlled, but something underneath it wasn't. "She has no claim here." "The letter refers to Sandra Kowalski's estate," Marcus said, "not yours." Silence. "I'd recommend," Marcus said to the officers, "removing the cuffs." They removing the cuffs. They removed the cuffs. I rubbed my wrists. I didn't look at my father. I looked at the front of the church, at the photograph of my mother they had set on an easel, her in a garden somewhere, squinting into the sun, almost smiling. "Hi, Mom," I thought. I made it. I went back to our pew. Marcus sat beside me. The service proceeded. My father stood at the front and spoke about his wife of 38 years. He said she was patient and devoted, and that she had sacrificed a great deal for her family. He said it the way he said everything, smoothly, convincingly, for the room. I thought about the $40. I thought about the bus station. I thought about the couch I slept on for 6 weeks and the Tim Hortons shift that started at 5 in the morning and the way I used to save my change in a peanut butter jar because I was afraid of what would happen if I ran out. I let him talk. I had my mother's photograph to look at. Afterward, in the foyer, an older woman touched my arm. She had my mother's eyes, which meant she was one of my mother's sisters. My Aunt Claire, I thought, though I hadn't seen her since I was 12. "She talked about you," she said. Her voice was careful. "More than you'd think." I didn't know what to do with that. I still don't, honestly. I said, "Thank you for telling me." She held my hand for a moment, then let it go. My father found me near the door as I was putting on my coat. He positioned himself the way he always had, slightly too close, so that moving away would require a visible effort. An old trick. I had outgrown it by the time I was 30. "What do you want?" he said. Low enough that only I could hear. "I wanted to say goodbye to my mother," I said. "I did that. And the letter is real," I said. "You might want to speak to a solicitor. My mother apparently updated some documentation 11 months ago. You'll learn about that through the proper channels." His jaw moved. "You put her up to that." "I haven't spoken to my mother in 8 years," I said. "She did what she did on her own." This, I knew, was the worst thing I could have said to him. Not because it hurt him, because it meant there had been a version of my mother operating outside his knowledge, quietly, in the 11 months before she died, and he hadn't known. I buttoned my coat. "I'm not doing this for money," I said. "In case that's what you're building your next argument around. Whatever she left, I'll figure out what to do with it. but she chose to leave it. I'm going to respect that. I walked out into the November air. Marcus was waiting on the steps, hands in his pockets, looking at the parking lot with the expression he has when he's finished with a room and ready to move on. Ready? He said. Yeah, I said. Let's go home. We drove back to Hamilton on the 400. The highway was gray and wide and familiar. Marcus had the radio on low CBC, some afternoon program about Ontario wine country, someone talking about autumn and ice wine and the way frost changes the sugar in the grape. I watched the billboards go by. He really thought no one had copies, I said. At some point. People like that always do, Marcus said. I thought about my mother and her garden, squinting into the sun. I thought about the fact that she had, at some point in the last year of her life, found a solicitor and made a decision and kept it to herself. I don't know what that means about her, whether it was courage or guilt or something smaller and harder to name. I'm still working on that. What I know is this. I went back. Not for him. Not to win anything. Not to watch him lose. I went because she was my mother and she was gone, and I hadn't had enough time with the version of her that might have existed outside the walls of that house, and I needed to stand in a room and say goodbye. I did that. Everything else that happened, Marcus and the letter and the cuffs coming off in front of 60 people, that wasn't the plan. The plan was just to be there. But my father can never let anyone simply be there. He always has to make it into something he controls. He found out that day that I had stopped being something he could control somewhere around the age of 17, standing on Dunlop Street with a garbage bag, watching his car disappear. It just took a while for him to see it. I called my Aunt Claire the following week. We talked for almost an hour. She told me things about my mother I hadn't known, that she had kept a box of newspaper clippings, my law school graduation announcement that ran in the Hamilton Spectator, a note I had sent to one of my old teachers that he had forwarded on, that she had shown the clippings to Claire once, quietly when my father was out. I cried in the car afterward, properly cried the way I hadn't let myself at the service. I don't know what my relationship with Claire will become. Maybe not much. Maybe something. She has my mother's eyes, and she called me by my name like she'd been saving it up. That's enough for now. That's more than I had before. My father has since engaged a solicitor of his own. Marcus says to let the process work. I'm letting it work. The frost came early this year. Early even for southern Ontario. I drove to work this morning, and the fields along the highway were white and still and lit up by a sun that had no warmth in it yet. Just light. Just the promise of it. I have learned to make do with the promise of things. I built a whole life on it. I'm still building. I've thought a lot about what actually happened that day. Not the legal part, not the letter, not the cuffs, not Marcus holding up his credentials in the middle of a church while 60 people sat in silence. I mean, what happened underneath all of that? The thing that was really being settled. My father spent 38 years building a version of himself that other people would believe in. Coached hockey, ran fundraisers, shook hands, kept his voice low and steady in every room. He understood, very early on, that if you control the story, you control the room. And for a long time it worked. It worked on our town. It worked on my mother. It almost worked on me. What he didn't account for was that I left. And when you leave, when you actually go and build something from nothing, in a city where nobody knows your father's name, you find out who you actually are. Not the version someone else decided on. The real one. The one that shows up at 5 in the morning for a Tim Hortons shift because rent is due and nobody is coming to cover it. The one that defers a scholarship, saves change in a jar, studies at night after working all day, and does it without once calling home to ask for help. That version of me, the one I built in 11 years of silence, is the one who walked into that church. And I think, somewhere in the middle of that service, my father finally saw her. Not me at 17, the girl he could still imagine as runaway, as ungrateful as the problem he had resolved, the woman I had actually become. And he had no story for her, no version of events that made her small. That's what I mean when I say he went pale. It wasn't fear of Marcus, not really. It was recognition. It was the moment the story he'd been telling didn't hold anymore. There's something I've been trying to articulate to myself since then, something about what it costs to make yourself into someone's footnote versus someone's whole chapter. My father chose to make me a footnote, the difficult daughter, the one who left. But the thing about footnotes is they're still in the book, and sometimes people read them more carefully than the main text. My mother read mine. Quietly, in the last year of her life, She found a solicitor and made a decision and kept it to herself. I don't know if that was her way of apologizing. I don't know if she understood what it meant to me or if she just did what she could with what courage she had left at the end. But she did it. She acted on her own, outside of his knowledge. That matters to me. Not the money. I meant what I told him. That's not what it's about. What matters is that she had, somewhere in her, a version of herself that was still capable of choosing something. I think about the $40 a lot. Not with bitterness anymore. Just as a fact. $40 in a garbage bag and a bus station. That was what he gave me. And I took it, and I made something from it, and I walked back into his town 11 years later with a solicitor's letter and a crown attorney beside me, and I didn't raise my voice once. Not once, because I didn't need to. That's what I want people to understand. If they're standing at their own version of a bus station right now, the thing that they take from you, the money, the name, the safety, the sense that someone somewhere is supposed to have your back, it is not the thing that determines what happens next. You are. What you do with the $40. Whether you open the jar. Whether you show up. It doesn't happen fast. It took me 11 years. But the life I have now, Marcus, our house in Hamilton, the work I do, the woman I am when I look in the mirror, I built that with my own hands, from the ground up. Nobody gave it to me, and nobody can take it.